here to discuss the ups, downs, and sideways of the sport of figure skating, and maybe give you +5 GOE along the way. Let's introduce this week's hosts.
Hi, I'm Lay. I'm being defeated by Australian time zones and work exhaustion, but valiantly trying to catch up to all the skating while I can. I'm Axel Sandwich on Twitter.
Hi, I'm Maryam, and I'm a sad Canadian, sadly watching the snowflakes pile up and thinking about how it could be watching figure skating instead. You can find me on Twitter at Lucky Loops.
Awesome. So this is going to be quite a long conversation, but I think a pretty necessary one because we are going to be talking about cultural appropriation, cultural borrowing, the issue of culture, in other words, and figure skating. So I just want to put out a long disclaimer at the start of this that this is a long and complex topic, which is also why we've spent quite a while preparing it. And due to the runtime, we won't be able to cover all facets or skaters. So we've tried to pick key examples of the issue because it's been a very topical one this season. And we also want to emphasize that this is designed to start the conversation, not to really make a ruling or a decision on it, but really kind of trying to prompt something of a discussion on an area that isn't really widely understood or discussed really in this sport, but I think nevertheless is quite important to sort of have as a conversational point. I also want to add that while we'll be focusing on figure skating's roots in predominantly white European and American cultures, white Western cultures aren't the only ones that have been accused of cultural appropriation. So you see discussions happening in K-pop, for example, and the appropriation of Black American culture in their genre. So in that instance, East Asian cultures don't have a history of political or social oppression of Black Americans the same way that they are in America, for example. But I just want to note that this is a discussion that's very much alive between all kinds of different culture groups, even those considered minorities commonly in Western society.
Before we begin, we just want to say that this episode contains discussions that include mentions of historical incidents that could be triggering for some. As well, while we do our best to ensure our analysis is backed by research and is as accurate as possible, we are open to corrections, so please let us know using our website inthelowpodcast.com. If you would like to take a look at the subtopics discussed in this episode, or fast forward to a certain section, you can find the timestamps included in the description of the video. Yeah, so cultural appropriation is like a sticky pot that's been stirred many, many times this season, even just starting in the off season. So we do have many examples, but would be here forever if we talked about them all. So as Lay said, we picked key examples. But before we start, we're going to talk a little bit about our cultural backgrounds. So, Lay?
So, yep, I'm ethnically Chinese. My parents are from mainland China, but I grew up in Australia. So, kind of consider myself a sort of hybrid upbringing because obviously, as a child of an immigrant family, we had a very interesting and unique experience, I think, growing up in Australia.
And I was born in Iraq, spent most of my childhood in Iraq/Jordan in the Middle East, and my teenage years I spent growing up here in Canada. So because Middle East, a lot of it is desert land, didn't actually know about skating till I got here.
Yeah, and obviously in researching this episode, we've also called on the diverse backgrounds of the other In the Loop members. So we want to especially thank Clara and Yagita for their input. But obviously, given our cultural backgrounds, we will not have a complete awareness and knowledge of all of the different cultures and religions, topics that we're covering in this episode. And in the spirit of wanting to give voices to those who are most close to the issue, again, this is all meant to start conversation, and we've definitely taken on board and looked into the words of people who've spoken out about various programs this season. But again, just disclaimer out there, we are definitely not the experts on all of the topics that we're going to be talking about. But we hope that the research and the links that we will be including in the transcript will help continue that discussion, especially amplifying people who probably have more of a voice and should be given more of a platform. after that very long introduction, what we're going to be talking about really is the range of ways that we interact with culture when it comes to the arts, because I think at the core of it, figure skating is a blend of sport and the performing arts. So we will be talking about concepts like cultural exchange, cultural borrowing, and cultural appropriation, which is kind of the hot buzzword of the Twitter sphere and the online figure skating fandom. But something that I really noticed in a lot of the ways that people are talking about cultural appropriation as a topic is sort of the feeling that it's almost become a checklist, or like kind of a situation where it's sort of you do one thing and like out spits cultural appropriation on the other end. And so kind of the thesis that we'll be kind of running with this episode is the idea that this is really more of a spectrum. It's not really a checklist, it's not a button. It's a spectrum about the way that someone interacts and talks and represents a culture in the performing arts and in expressing it. So that's essentially why we think it's worthy of discussion. And I think it's particularly important because cultural sensitivity is such a sort of topic of the modern age, because people are more interconnected and art is exposed to a lot more international influences thanks to the internet and a lot more diverse communities around the world. So minorities, especially those in Western societies such as the UK, US, Canada, Australia, in general, we're speaking out more about things that weren't okay in the past and were never okay, but are only now being articulated more regularly and on bigger platforms. And I think there's also been an increase in media representation and different cultures being depicted on TVs and movies. So while that's been a really, really great sign of like more diversity in our arts, the more people try to portray diverse cultures, obviously the more issues are brought up with how that portrayal is done.
The first academic criticism of cultural appropriation was kind of in the late 1970s. So it was around the same time where media was picking up things from other cultures and displaying them on TV, and media was becoming mainstream. So the debate has been around for a few decades, but why are we talking about it now when it comes to figure skating? So when the top skaters, like when you think about the medalists, when they skate to certain pieces of music, they set trends, especially if the judges reward them for it, which they almost certainly will if that skater is also usually known for getting high scores. And Twitter/social media has amplified the audience feedback compared to the past. And so the top skaters obviously will face more scrutiny than the skaters at the bottom of the chain. It's just the fact that like the people, like let's say small fed skaters, don't get talked about as much when it comes to culture appropriation doesn't mean that they're right or that they're not doing culture appropriation or that their cases aren't as strong. It's just true that a lot of skaters get more flack. It just comes with the fact that the top skaters have a lot more influence, a lot more people going to watch them, and a lot more people are going to talk about them.
Yeah, and I think along with the fact that like a lot of top skaters do have more influence and so more weight is given to the choices that they make with their programs, I think it's also important to acknowledge that figure skating is still very much an inaccessible sport, whether it's from like an economic perspective or from a geographical perspective to do. And so as skaters from like these small federations, they really have to rely a lot on more privileged skaters sometimes to showcase their cultures.
And when it does, it's not usually in a good way.
The one thing that I've personally felt with representation, especially of minority cultures, is the idea that when you have a lot of different varieties of stories and pieces depicting a certain culture, they're kind of free to be their own story and entity, and it's accepted that they're not representative of a whole culture. So if you consider like the whole range of stories that we have about like white men, for example, in sort of the middle class, we don't look at, for example, Fight Club and assume that every single white male out there is identical to the protagonist, or we don't watch Batman and assume everyone is Batman. But when you have media depicting minorities, we don't necessarily have that luxury because there's so little representation that each case where a culture is represented carries a certain weight to them. This shouldn't be the case, but it kind of is, that it becomes often representative of that entire culture because of the fact that there are so little alternatives out there. And so I think it's the same way with figure skating, given that many skaters from smaller federations have trouble meeting the tech minimums to get onto platforms like Worlds, like, you know, the Grand Prix series, with, you know, the lack of infrastructure that they have to support that high technical level. Many skaters don't get to have that stage to tell the stories and the programs and showcase the performances that they want. And so with that also comes the loss of the chance to showcase music from their country, to showcase costumes and ways of expression from that country. And so that's why when top skaters and when popular skaters in the limelight showcase a culture different to their own, or showcase a program that is specifically trying to depict a culture, it's why we put more scrutiny onto them, because theirs is often one of the rare and few chances that a particular culture has representation.
If you live in the Western world, chances are that you're going to be a lot less likely to have a profound and sustained contact with those cultures yourself, especially firsthand. So watching these people on screen, on TV, obviously gives a lot more weight to them, a lot more responsibility to try and do these programs with a lot of cultural sensitivity, because in a way your depiction is carrying a lot more weight because these people don't have much exposure to these cultures in the first place. So there is that matter of responsibility. But before we talk more about that, we'll get into what is actually cultural appropriation. So as defined by Oxford, it is the unacknowledged or inappropriate adoption of the customs, practices, ideas, so basically the culture of one people or society by members of another, and typically more dominant people or society. So when that academic criticism first came out in the 1970s, it had more of a political angle, criticizing colonialism, especially European colonialism. And it was basically describing the power dynamics of dominant cultures, exploiting the cultures of the subjugated classes, often to their detriment and often to the benefit of those dominant cultures. So if you think about Europe taking over other countries, selling the food they take and benefiting from that, or taking their arts and not crediting them,
putting them in museums.
Yeah, exactly. So that's where the debate started.
Yeah, and I think in figure skating, this political dimension of like economic exploitation isn't necessarily so much the focus, but it is, I think, a lot of the conversation that we will be having in this episode is around the erasure of representation and culture in the arts. Because inherently, I think exploring and being influenced by new cultures is what helps art to evolve, and it's not inherently a bad thing. But what it needs to be done with is a degree of sensitivity and respect. And I think a lot of the debate, at least online and in fan communities, is often around trying to define like what is or isn't appropriation. But I think what we're going to be exploring is this idea that when we say cultural appropriation or cultural sensitivity, it really is around being more critical about the kind of performance and representation you're trying to make in an artistic performance. So really thinking about the power structures, the stereotypes, or the impressions of a culture that you're either subconsciously or consciously portraying, especially if you're not from that culture. So it really isn't so much about intention or like, you know, someone deliberately trying to exert dominance over the other, but it is an acknowledgement that whether we intend to or not, there are a lot of power structures and stereotypes that we may be in danger of falling into when we try and tackle and express and perform something that is from a culture foreign to ours.
Yeah, like I don't think any skater goes out there and says, okay, this season I'm going to culturally appropriate this culture.
Yeah, absolutely not.
But they do have that responsibility, especially if they are not from that culture, even more so if they are a dominant culture, to think critically about their programs. And a term that I've heard people use instead of cultural appropriation is cultural misappropriation. So just misappropriating the culture you're supposed to be depicting, especially when your portrayal has more weight than other portrayals, like we talked about earlier. So it was voiced predominantly by minorities in Western countries because those are the places where that dynamic is most prominent. So you'll hear a lot of issues come up, mostly from people that have been living in the West for a bit of time because they've experienced that power dynamic firsthand. A common rebuttal people say when talking about cultural appropriation is they would say, but these people are okay with it. They might be more okay with it if that power dynamic does exist. So if you're a minority, let's say in the West, but if you go back to your own country, you're no longer the minority. There's no longer that power structure or dynamic. So it's really hard to look at the connection between immigrants and the culture when it's been interrupted by colonialism and migration, and to call that connection perfectly intact and rely on that representation of the culture.
A quick note about programs like Riverdance, which is not so much brought up in conversations around cultural appropriation. I think partly because there is obviously a historical context here in that Irish people and immigrants were treated poorly in America, for example, when they were first immigrating over to the New World. But historical, like the passing of time and history has allowed them to slowly assimilate into American culture. And so they're not as transparently considered other on the surface as, for example, Muslim refugees are in America at this point in time, or Mexican immigrants. But at the same time, another facet of why Riverdance is not really brought up in conversations around cultural appropriation is because it was created by an American with Irish ancestry. And the premise of the show and the music is about the movement of Irish people into the New World and the sharing and exploration of culture. So it actually is about that Irish American experience of, you know, being a culture moving into a different world and dominant culture, and the sharing and cultural exchange that goes on in that space, and not so much about Irish culture from Ireland and with all of that deep historical connection. And I think it also is important to acknowledge that this occurs in the context of Irish culture being quite commercialized rather than authentic in America, which is often a criticism from people who are actually from Ireland, and is treated with a slightly higher degree of suspicion because of that historical way that America has treated the Irish. So it's important to, I think, acknowledge that culture is a living thing and it transforms constantly. So there is often no sort of historically authentic culture to distill, and it's a common frustration that I have when at least hearing people talk about cultural appropriation, and often they'll use the example that Chinese people from China are fine with this, so why are you taking offense? Something that I really feel is that I'm Chinese, but I'm also Chinese Australian. And the culture of someone who's Chinese Australian and what they associate with that cultural experience is very, very different to that of someone growing up in China. But I don't think that makes it any less valid of a cultural experience with particular commonalities, histories, and traditions. It's just a different and possibly a younger cultural tradition. So if you go on Facebook, for example, there is a very popular group called Subtle Asian Traits. And that is kind of made up of Chinese and Asian Australians, Asian Americans, kids basically with an Asian immigrant background, but who grew up in a Western country. So it's actually quite shocking how many common experiences you have that are just completely unique to that particular experience. And I would say in particular what we would call microaggressions when it comes to racism. So things like that are probably well-intentioned but still nevertheless offensive are things like, you know, white locals complimenting you on your English despite you having been born or grown up in Australia and English being your native language, or people casually mispronouncing your name and thinking that it's okay just because it's an Asian name or last name, and some people will straight up not go to the effort. And people in subtle Asian traits and in other groups like that, we do make light of that. It's treated as a joke. With that also comes particular sensitivities and particular aspects of cultural expression that we, as this hybrid cultural background, are more sensitive to than others. So I don't really think it's a valid argument to shut down a discussion around cultural appropriation with just the idea that like it's fine because someone in China said it was fine. So that's a really important distinction, I think, that needs to be made.
So like you said, culture is fluid and we need to recognize people's experiences with it are different. So what is exactly culture in this context? So we need to be specific when we're talking about culture appropriation. What is culture? So culture is basically our collective experiences, traditions, and beliefs. A lot of our perceptions of certain cultures is shaped heavily by pop culture and media.
And disproportionately by Hollywood, I think, and also Western culture because of how widely they influenced like everyone else's cultures around the world, whether we like to admit it or not. So yeah, I think it's really important sometimes to recognize that things that we might by default associate with a certain culture may not really have as pure like of a root as we think it does. Because again, like we've said before, culture is kind of a constantly living and evolving thing, and it will be influenced by outside foreign influences, and then it'll be reintegrated and then influenced again. So a really good example of this is belly dancing. So there is a historian on Reddit called CPT Buck who did a thread that we will link in our transcript, which outlined the journey of how belly dancing as we know it in pop culture and how it's represented in the media developed in history. And so it turns out that it came from like the Middle East, but it came from sort of 19th century European writings describing, like interpreting a particular type of dancing that was originated in brothels, basically in the Middle East in the 19th century. It was interpreted by European writings. Then it was kind of, it went on this journey where it was performed by European showmen, kind of taking Middle Eastern performers out of their country and put into Europe and sort of made to perform those things. Then it was kind of taken up and adapted by American and European like vaudeville and cabaret acts. Then it was thrown onto the screen and popularized through media, then exported back to Egypt, and then it sort of kind of then was reinterpreted and kind of reclaimed by Egyptian culture. So it's just kind of an example of how something that we might innocently kind of associate with a particular culture has actually gone through a huge history of like interpretation, reinterpretation, and then reclaiming by the original culture that it came out of. So if you're going to say like, you know, that you've appropriated from X culture, it's often very hard to kind of know what you're talking about or whether it really is so pure, so to speak. But it doesn't mean that we can't talk about it, and it doesn't mean that it's not an aspect of that particular culture. But it's often not as pure, I suppose, is the key takeaway from that.
Right. And I think one aspect about culture that gets lost in conversation a lot is the historicity of the culture. So if you're talking about, again, cultures are fluid and cultures evolve and are dynamic, but there are cultures that have been lost throughout the years. No matter how hard we try to conserve them, it's been thousands and thousands of years. So it's really hard to talk about what are exactly the defined customs of that culture. So if you're talking about ancient Egypt, for example, their culture and traditions are very, very different from modern Egypt. So if you're talking about appropriating ancient Egyptian culture, it's not you can't exactly say this person should go and ask, you know, the ancient Egyptians what they think about this portrayal, because you can't do that. And another thing is, can you really ask a culture for permission to use something from it? It's not something you can do, but what you can do is be culturally sensitive and try to include people from that culture and their opinion on your portrayal and representation of that culture.
Yeah, I think there's a danger in kind of assuming that like it goes back to that kind of checklist thing where people say like, oh, well, I've gotten permission from like this person because they're part of that culture, and then so it's okay. Or, it's really difficult because cultures and people within those cultures, like the whole point of recognizing that diversity is also recognizing that, just because you're part of the same culture doesn't mean you have the same opinions. And it doesn't mean that everyone has the same attitudes towards things like cultural appropriation or borrowing. So it is really difficult when we talk about permission and talk about this idea that we have to, go back to where this particular thing originated and like get the permission from someone, just pluck them out of their homes and be like, please give me permission to do this. Like, it really isn't kind of a checklist, but it's more about the process of how you get to that representation and how you construct a program and what factors and people you've consulted and taken into consideration along the way. And I think what Maryam really pointed out also is like that history, it's important that in trying to trace the roots and the original culture of a particular act, in doing that we don't erase acknowledgement that history was a lot more complex and a lot more culturally diverse and, messy than we like to think. So, when talking about the Axis powers in World War II, for example, it's not as simple as, oh, well, you were part of like an Axis power and so you don't have the right to represent, XYZ, because, that within those powers, within wars, within countries, there were always resistance groups. There were always people opposed to the dominant way that culture is now remembered in history. So I think it's just, again, a process of being sensitive in not only how you represent a culture, but also how you criticize that act of representation.
Right, and when we're talking about culture, it's not exactly the same thing as race. It's not synonymous with race. So Jewish culture spans a lot of ethnic backgrounds, for example. And if you're talking about the Arab world, they have so many dialects. They have near 300 dialects, so you can't pinpoint it to, oh, this culture is synonymous with this race. But for the sake of this discussion, we're going to talk a little bit about both culture and race and how they both connect.
So I think, again, like, because culture is so hard to define and the reactions of people from a cultural group will differ, the question of how do we even have a discussion around what is or isn't cultural appropriation is also like an important question to consider. So, like, again, something that I somewhat observed is that sometimes the discussion can kind of become almost a trump card situation where it's like, oh, well, I've got a Chinese person here, but like my Chinese person's been living in China longer and they have a different opinion. So that opinion trumps yours. Like it sometimes feels a little bit like one-upsmanship. And I think it doesn't acknowledge that, some people, multiple people from a giant cultural and diverse cultural background like China, for example, there will be many, many different opinions. And you really can't just summarize it with like, the Chinese people say it's okay, so it's fine. So I think for me, it's about a discussion, and it's about obviously like recognizing that you'll never get to a very clean and clear-cut answer, but it's about listening more to those who are part of the marginalized group who is affected, and recognizing their voices as people who've lived through that experience or who have firsthand experience in some of the issues should be given a wider platform and a louder voice than those who may not have, any connection with that culture.
So when you're talking about people's experiences, one thing that you learn in psychology is that emotions in your brain are not hardwired, but they're instead built. So you build your emotions as you go through your life based on your own experiences. So different people react differently to different things based on their lived experiences.
And I guess on the question of who's responsible, I think for the vast majority of skaters, programs are a collaborative effort. So for us, it's really about education and more conversation around the concept, because we have to keep in mind the cultural context that many, many skaters and choreographers and coaches are not from like Western backgrounds, such as, US or Canadian or the UK, where cultural appropriation as a concept is very sort of known and at the forefront of public discussion. So for many cultures, that really isn't something that has yet entered into their consciousness, often because not all cultures are multicultural in the same way that US or Australia, for example, is. So, a lot of the question sometimes is like, should we cut them some slack? And I think personally that for me is like, absolutely, because even in Western countries, I think cultural appropriation isn't very widely understood or well defined because there's so much debate and controversy surrounding it. So I think it's really important when considering criticism of skaters, particularly from largely monoethnic cultures, such as Japan, for example, or many parts of Asia, where you really don't get that much exposure to diverse cultures within society on a regular basis. That we should be mindful that not everyone has the same cultural background and education and level of awareness.
Right, especially if they're homogenized and they don't encounter it as nearly as often. So when we're talking about skaters, do they or do they not have a minimum responsibility to do research on a program? One thing we have to keep in mind is that for a lot of skaters, there is that language barrier, and the material in their own language might not be as easily accessible. But when you look at those skaters, a lot of them do work with North American white choreographers and coaches who do speak English, who do have a lot more exposure, like Clay said, to cultural appropriation and what it is, and they do have a lot more access to the source material. So I feel like a lot of them do have that responsibility to be a lot more mindful and expect to know a bit more about the story they're trying to get their skaters to sell and to portray.
And I think especially considering how young most skaters are, especially when you talk about the ladies, like these are teenagers and quite young adults. So it is very natural that they would be relying and trusting their choreographers and coaches. So while I do think that skaters should, just as a performer, I think put in some research into what they're portraying and really try and understand what they're trying to say, I do think the bulk of the responsibility should nevertheless still fall on the adults who are guiding their journeys. And that's why I would put more emphasis on choreographers and coaches especially, who often suggest the programs and music and stuff for skaters as well. Moving on, I guess, to the substantial part of the discussion, there are 3 key facets of adapting cultures that we're going to be discussing for this episode. So the first one is this idea of apparent intention. So when we're looking at a program and really critically examining it in relation to this topic, we look at the intention that we're gathering from the outward appearance, obviously, because we don't have access to the skaters' internal thoughts and feelings. But what is the apparent intention based on what they're putting out on the ice? The second factor is adherence to the norms, rules, and sensitivities of the culture of origin. So, for example, whether they're making use of something religious or sacred from a religion that's not their own in a secular context, if they're, sexualizing elements of a culture with different modesty standards. You'll see a lot of that criticism come through in things like Halloween costumes that are like a sexy, like Native American person with a headdress. Like those are sort of very archetypal examples of cultural appropriation. And the third facet that we'll look at is quality. So whether the output of your work pays tribute to what you're borrowing from, how much effort has been put in that is visible and apparent into researching this program, into consulting people from that culture, or is there a lack of effort? So while we won't claim that this is anything like a definitive answer to the question of cultural appropriation, we will be using this as a rough framework and a sort of lens through which we're going to be critically talking about some of the programs that we're going to raise as examples.
Going on to talking about these in a little bit more detail, when you're talking about intention, are you attempting to honor what you're borrowing from, or are you in a way, whether consciously or subconsciously, exploiting that said culture? So you see that a lot in programs that tool to demonstrate range. So if you go out and say, okay, I want to do this program, my intention with this program is I want to show the judges that I have this interpretive range. If you're thinking about it solely from that perspective, there is a bit of an exploitative side to it, because especially if, let's say, you win a medal, you get prize money. The person benefiting is obviously you getting that money. If you haven't done your research, and if that was your sole motivator to do this program, and if you're only really portraying a superficial view of the program and still get all of this prize money, then that culture you're borrowing from isn't benefiting. Actually, the opposite of benefiting, because you're not doing an accurate portrayal in the first place, but also the only person benefiting is you.
And I think something that's really relevant to talk about is this idea that doing something that is different and portraying a different culture is often correlated or naturally corresponds with this idea of pushing yourself out of your comfort zone. Because obviously, like, it is doing something different. You are being challenged because you are being forced to portray something that you are not familiar with. So in the context of skating, in the context of expanding someone's range of expression as a performer, it is particularly relevant this season, which is 2 seasons before Beijing Olympics. So it is often the season where a lot of skaters are experimenting and trying to showcase the variety of different facets that they can portray. So I guess in particular, it is slightly different to be skating a culturally different program in competition versus exhibition, because in an exhibition gala, that performance is designed much more for the audience, because unlike a competition, the exhibition is around creating enjoyment in those watching. Whereas competition inherently, I think, places the focus on the skater's own individual qualities, because that's what they're getting judged on. So generally, I don't think it's unrealistic and inaccurate to say that often borrowing from another culture is a way for a skater to expand their range, artistry, and interpretation. And I think a really good example of this is even explicitly stated by Benoit Richard for Satoko Miyahara's Cleopatra short program. So he says in an interview that he wanted to explore something different, and was surprised when she said she'd like to skate to that piece of music, because he thought of her as a very classic and conservative skater and wanted to explore something different from her personality. So I think the intention of wanting to kind of explore something different is always like a valid sort of intention to have, and is definitely something a skater needs to be doing to expand and challenge themselves in terms of their performance ability. But it does become somewhat of an issue when that is automatically correlated with just skating to a completely different program from a different culture, and if that's the only motivation for doing so, because I think it then raises questions around what is your intention? Is there any facet of that is around actually being interested in the culture that you're borrowing the program from, or is it driven solely by that sense of wanting to challenge oneself?
Yeah, especially if you or your choreographer haven't done much research to look into the culture in the first place. That really tells you a lot about the intention. But going back to what you said about competition versus exhibition programs, this is not to say that people can't skate to, a culturally heavy program and not do it well in competition. If you're yourself skating to something from your own culture and just want a lot more people to get exposure to music from your own culture, so your culture is benefiting from this, you're benefiting from this, so it's not naturally egotistic. And it's not to say that you can't do it well. You just have to put a lot more research before putting it into a competitive program that's going to get a lot more exposure. Another thing we're going to talk about is the concept of tragedy porn. A lot of figure skating has a tendency to equate tragic stories with depth.
and maturity, especially if those stories have pieces of music that are really dramatically heavy and make it really, really easy for the skater to get into a dramatic, sad mode.
I think we need to talk about the elephant in the room, which is that this is the season of Holocaust programs. Like, I don't know why, I don't know who got together in a room and decided that this was a theme, but there are quite a lot of Holocaust programs that we need to talk about that all center obviously around Schindler's List as the piece of music.
Yeah, so there's a difference between skating to a movie with a Holocaust context and skating to a movie about the Holocaust. At the time that Schindler's List came out, there weren't all that many movies that have been made about the Holocaust, which definitely contributed to its popularity back then and its popularity still now. So it's about this German fella named Schindler who saved a lot of Polish Jewish refugees, and it's based on a historical novel called Schindler's Ark. The skaters and the choreographers that make those programs kind of rely on these threads of hope and suffering to give intensity to the program and to show that the skater has emotional depth and can skate to something that's really, really heavy. And they're using the dramatic soundtrack as a tool to implement this, especially seeing as a skater is usually at a young age and does not have all that much life experience. So this is the easiest way for them to do so. A lot of programs put the focus on the suffering of the Holocaust to give depth to the program and to show, oh, this skater has emotional depth and can skate to something that's really heavy. So the theme becomes one that depicts the Holocaust.
Inherently, I don't think like the desire to express something about that particular movie is like a issue in itself. I think what has sort of become an unfortunate theme of this season, though, is seeing a slew of really offensive, like Holocaust costumes that have accompanied those programs. And to me, they don't feel very promising for revealing how much a skater's really thought about what they're depicting or trying to say about such a heavy topic. Because I think, and we'll get into the specific examples in a moment, but I think a lot of the costumes interpretations are very, very literal. Whereas for most programs about using music from a particular movie, that wouldn't be an issue because you're simply, reflecting something that happened in the movie or a character from that movie. But I think when so much of Schindler's List and those programs are sort of about the overall tragedy of the Holocaust, when you see very, very literal programs that almost treat the theme and the music as just another movie with costumes and you're just portraying a character from there, it just makes you question whether this is an approach that really does justice to how we should be when we're talking about a topic like the Holocaust. So I think for me, the word it's somewhat distasteful. For example, I think the first costume that we saw from Satoko Miyahara was this grey dress with the Star of David, sort of created using crisscrossing straps on her back. So, in the context of like Schindler's List and in the context of the Holocaust, the symbol of the Star of David was a symbol of persecution. And here it was used as a kind of design choice. And this grey, ashy, dirty dress really makes you wonder what the intent of the costume designer was. Like, what was the facet of the movie she was trying to portray? And I really can't help but feel as though it was capitalizing on the tragedy of the victims of the Holocaust being forced out of their homes, put into slum-like conditions and, being marked by a symbol of persecution that is now then used very casually as a design element. For me, that seemed very distasteful. And thankfully, she changed that after her first appearance. But unfortunately, it wasn't the end for this particular designer.
So the same designer is Juju Designs, or Julia on Instagram. She also designed Yuna Shiraiwa's dress. So her program is from the movie Amen by Costa Gavras. So it examines the links between the Vatican and Nazi Germany. if you saw pictures of the costume, it's very disturbing. So if you saw the part that's like near her abdomen, there's red streaks of cloth that depict kind of a bloody gash or wound on an ash gray dress. So that is distasteful, and it is very exploitative of the tragedy. There are a lot of ways you can make a costume that doesn't do either of these things.
I think in the context of the music that she was skating to, which was basically around the links between the sort of human experimentations, I believe, and things that they authorized during the horrific events of the Holocaust, like it just seems like it places the emphasis on the suffering and the literal injuries and wounds suffered by the victims rather than like literally any other part of the movie. In the performing arts, the costume and the music work together in tandem to give signals to the audience about what the focus of this particular program is. And so, again, it feels distasteful for that emphasis to be more on the suffering and on the physical wounds and injuries that resulted from the horrific events and tragedy rather than any other thing.
Yeah, and if you're a Jewish person in the audience watching this, like a lot of people have a lot of emotional connections to the past, to what happened. So just the sight of this might trigger some people.
It's quite just a disturbing dress in general. And I know the idea was to be unsettling, I suppose, but a lot of the movie centers around resisting that horror. So it makes you wonder, like, you know, why is the emphasis on the costume not around the acts of, you know, bravery and valor of going against an awful regime and rather on the suffering? And that really, I think, goes back to this idea that the tragedy of the Holocaust is what is being exploited and depicted and put emphasis on without truly exploring, I guess, like what that means and how that should be respectfully portrayed. It's making the tragedy and the suffering in itself the theme and the aspect of the music and the program that the skaters chosen to emphasize. And so that's why it, being one note about this, is particularly exploitative, in my opinion. But I think I do have to say that the worst Schindler's List costume for me was definitely that of Anton Shulapov from Russia. His costume is like a hybrid mix of Schindler's, or I assume Schindler's kind of suit and tie, which then is cut off halfway and turns into the striped outfits that Holocaust victims wore in concentration camps, complete with the Star of David on his chest. So, like, for me, it's the really overly literal representation that for me makes it feel like a costume. And it feels like it's merely viewing the events and the people and situations portrayed in Schindler's List as just like fictional characters in a movie. It feels very disrespectful to be mixing the two, and it feels like a lack of thought was put into really the significance of literally showing the striped prisoner outfits that Holocaust victims wore, because it's not a costume. You know, it's a symbol of like enormous amounts of pain and persecution that still has huge resonance with the generations that came after the victims of the Holocaust. And to see it being chopped up really and taken and exploited for its parts as part of a costume to just represent like the characters in the movie feels just way too frivolous for something that should be given a lot more weight. And not only was Anton's costume, with its almost parodic like combination of two characters, quote unquote, really offensive, I think even worse than the Star of David was the number, right? Because that was a number that replaced the names of the Jews that were the victims of the Holocaust. They were forcibly taken away from them and they were given a number instead. So like, whose number is he wearing? Does he even know this? It's just every single part of a historical reference, especially for an event like the Holocaust, is so crucial and essential and meaningful. And to see it being so casually used without any guarantee that the deep weight behind each of these elements was appreciated is just appalling.
Like you have so many choices to choose from tasteful designs that don't carry a lot of heavy emotional weight to them. So another kind of horrifying case was about 3 years ago. So there's this Russian reality TV show called Ice Age. And this Russian pair, Tatiana Navka and Andrei Bukovsky, they wore gray concentration camp prisoner costumes that had a Star of David on them. And in the middle of the program and near the end, they were miming shooting at each other. And so one person was shooting, the other person was, acting as if they were dying. And they had makeup on themselves to look very, very bruised and frail. So it doesn't take a lot in this case to see that they were tasteless, and that they were very, very exploitative of this image of Jewish people.
Yeah, and I think what is really enlightening in this season especially is when you contrast those approaches to depicting Schindler's List with Jason Brown, who himself is Jewish and is skating to Schindler's List this season. So even from his costume to the way he's spoken about the program, you really feel the difference. So to quote Jason, he said, my background is obviously Jewish and the story is so touching. He said he grew up learning about the Holocaust and Oskar Schindler and the stories and always wanted to skate to it, but says it has to be when I'm at the level maturity-wise that I'm ready to skate for it. So I think you can really tell in the way that Jason talks about the program, talks about the sense of simplistic maturity that needs to be developed before he can really grasp what he's skating to, and the fact that it's taken him until now. But, for him, it was very clear that it was a process that he went through to feel ready even to start telling that story. And he's Jewish, right? Like, if anyone has the authority and the cultural background and the history to be able to tell that story in an authentic way, it would be someone like Jason who's from that culture. But, I think the fact that he's treating it with such weight and the fact that he thought he had to wait until he was himself ready in some sense to skate to it lends credence to the fact that this is, this theme, this topic in general is something that can't be approached lightly, and is something that, for example, for Jason, it's something he said, I want to put my own take on it and see what I can bring to life. And so it's a really good example of the contrast of someone for whom this isn't just a movie, right? This isn't just a set of characters that feel as fictional as like the Marvel superheroes. For him, it's something that I think carries with it a certain family history, I'm sure, and a weight to it that he most deeply feels the need to pay respect to. And so I think it's a really, really telling contrast when you look at the approaches taken through the costumes of other skaters versus Jason's.
And another issue that comes up a lot in when you're talking about different cultures is this concept of exoticism, which I have personal experiences with. I have a lot of friends whose names aren't, Americanized. They're not Western names. So when people ask them, "What is your name?" and they say this, and they say, "Oh, that's so exotic." I know they mean well, but exotic is what you would call like a tropical plant or animal. It's not really what you want to be defined as a person. It kind of, in a way, inadvertently, whether subconsciously or not, kind of alienates the person. And it's the same thing when you're talking about culture. So there is that danger of shallow cultural representation on the international stage in an attempt, and in a not really well-researched attempt, to show, oh, I want to skate to this exotic piece of music, or I want to show this exotic culture. A lot of times these might not even be cultural programs, but pieces that represent an entire culture, despite the fact that they weren't authentic portrayals in the first place and were actually just adapted and transformed for Western tastes.
When we're talking about this, what I mean a lot of the time is thinking about historic war horses. So things like Miss Saigon, Madame Butterfly, for example. These are, portrayed, and they're set in exotic, quote unquote, cultures when they were created at the time, but they are filtered very much through Western tastes. So You know, the opera of Madame Butterfly, for example, utilizes Western instruments, it uses Western music traditions, Western languages, and it is very much the portrayal of an exotic culture filtered to become acceptable and popular with the tastes at the time, which were Western, basically. And so a lot of the time with figure skating as a sport that has developed very much out of a Western tradition, skaters are often having to balance the risk of judges not liking their programs because there is the subjective judge component, which is why many war horses have historically become popular, because they've been proven to be popular with the judges and accepted. But when repeatedly kind of used by skaters, the danger is that they become shortcuts to portraying something that is different, quote unquote, and somewhat exotic, but nonetheless still perpetuating the fact that these are actually programs that were adapted and kind of filtered for Western tastes in the first place. So my question is, you know, if you're skating to a war horse, despite the fact that it might be set in a different culture, is it truly being different versus, you know, a skater taking the risk of skating to an actually like authentic piece from their culture, whether historical or modern?
Especially when you consider the fact that, you know, judges like these war horses and they like rewarding marks for these war horses. So, you know, judges are into these portrayals of these cultures or into these westernized portrayals.
I think it's not even so much sometimes the fact that the judges love war horses. Like, I don't know if I can even say judges love war horses, but it's almost like, you know, you won't be punished for the music if you skate to a war horse. But I don't know if you can necessarily say the same thing if a skater chose to skate to a very, very different, somewhat offbeat piece from their own culture. It's a kind of invisible pressure there, and it's a consideration that skaters have to pay attention to because of the nature of the way figure skating is judged. But, you know, like when you think about, for example, Madame Butterfly, it started out as a short story by an American lawyer and writer, John Luther Long, which was published in 1898. And it was Long collaborating with David Belasco, who's also not Japanese, who adapted it into a one-act play, which then inspired Puccini to compose the opera, which debuted in 1904. So there really was no connection really with Japan at all in its creation, despite the fact that probably when you think of traditional Japanese war horses, you would probably think of Madame Butterfly as the thing that kind of represents Japan in that suite of music. And, you know, things like the fact that Madame Butterfly portrays outdated Orientalist stereotypes was criticized as early as like 1988 when David Henry Hwang wrote a parody opera called M Butterfly. And so, like, and Miss Saigon is then based on Madame Butterfly, for example. So the fact that, like, all these sort of different exotic war horses stem from very much similar roots is something that has been pointed out for a long time now.
Right, and another one is Shahrazad. So it's a Russian suite based on this Middle Eastern story that's taken from 1001 Nights. So it's been around for a long time. Look at Yuna and Meryl Davis and Charlie Waite have skated to it. To be fair, the music is really nice to listen to, but does it actually portray the story? I don't think so.
There's a reason why they're popular war horses. They are beautiful pieces of music, but when you think about the fact that, you know, when people think about classic figure skating music that is exotic and from a foreign culture, many people would think about these pieces, but it basically hides the fact that they didn't originate from authentic sources at all. A more contemporary example I will raise is Chinese programs. So for example, So Young-wi, a Korean junior skater, is skating to Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, which I would argue is probably one of the most popular contemporary pieces of Chinese music that a lot of skaters skate to. So if you think about popular pieces, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon is very, very widely used, especially in the recent quad. And that particular movie itself was actually made by Ang Lee the director to be more easily palatable for Western audiences. So I think it's important, and it acts as an example of the fact that a cultural piece that becomes kind of a stereotypical representation of a particular culture doesn't necessarily have to be sacred in the sense that it's a spiritual or like, you know, some really deeply culturally significant piece. It can just be the fact that it's the only piece that anyone ever skates to when it comes to contemporary Chinese music, or it's the safest and the only safe music to skate to because there's only been a little bit of precedent for the judges liking that kind of music. So, for example, with Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, it actually belongs to the wuxia genre of film about xia shi, who are people who know Chinese martial arts. So there's a history and a set of traditions attached to that particular art form, but it doesn't really represent Chinese spirituality, and it doesn't really hold like a deep spiritual meaning necessarily as a source material, but it does represent like Chinese culture in an international context in figure skating. So while I think, for example, So Young skating to it isn't really as egregious as if she'd like, you know, taken something very, very sacred and spiritual and should never be skated to, it is somewhat sad when that is one of the only pieces of Chinese music we ever hear on the figure skating stage, because it's really not, it just lacks that variety that makes a culture so rich in the first place.
Yeah, and it's also sad because there's so many more to choose with all of these war horses. You could actually go to the culture and you have so many choices of programs that you could choose, but a lot of times skaters and choreographers won't even start suggesting these pieces because they feel limited by the fact that they don't know if it's safe or if the judges will like it, like Lay said. So another aspect of where the culture originates from is adhering to the sensitivities of said cultures. So there are problems when you use meaningful source material and you fail to recognize how heavy-weighted some of the pieces are, or some of the aspects of cultures that you're taking. And another problematic music choice is Moa's Strange Fruits by Billie Holiday. So it was suggested as a program announcement, and there was so much universal backlash around that program because the music is very, very specific to the culture and the lyrics of the said music. It's very offensive to skate to it if you're not actually from the said culture. And a really good thing is that they were receptive to the feedback, and just because of like the sheer magnitude and how many people responded negatively to it, they changed the piece of music in response to the backlash.
I think it's important to note that there was no explicit message or anything from Benoit Richard, who choreographed the program, on this backlash. But I think what made Moa's music selection so egregious and so difficult to accept was because Strange Fruits, the song, was used as a protest song for the Black American community, and the lyrics explicitly referenced lynching as a practice, and it really wasn't a song where the lyrics could be interpreted in any other way except literally, and it wasn't a song where those lyrics could be ignored either, because the ignoring of the protesting voices of Black Americans was a key, I guess, fundamental basis for the civil rights movement, which is when this song was popularized and created. And so it's a really rare example, I guess, of a piece of music that is so integrally connected to the place, the time, and the purpose of its creation, that to skate to it in any other way that doesn't reflect that would be disrespectful, because you're erasing something that is so integral to that program's origin. But Moa, as a Japanese skater, you know, not having that cultural background and not having that experience, not having any of the history and the deeply painful and personal history associated with all of the oppression that Black Americans were protesting against in the civil rights movement, it's not a story for her to tell. And I think it's a very rare, clear-cut case where you can really feel that this is not a piece of music that is open to anyone to interpret. It's a music with deeply personal, heavy cultural significance, and it is in some ways elevated to this sense of being quite sacred to the people who are most deeply affected by it. So I think it's a really interesting example of that kind of music, because it's quite rare for there to be that kind of music to be skated to. And kind of similarly, Oksana Dominya and Maxim Shavalan, I think cultural programs was actually a theme for the ice dancers to skate to. And their Aboriginal program at the time actually received a lot of mainstream backlash as well. And I think what really distinguishes that particular program as being extremely disrespectful and appropriative was because of the lack of research and the almost parody-like tone that the skaters performed it. So that if you watch the program, there are definitely moments where it feels like the choreography was designed to create like a sense of humor and a sense of ridiculousness. And in an interview with about the program, I think it was Oksana who said, you know, I thought it was just crazy, but once we have tried it, we immediately fell in love with it. So I think it's, again, highlighting that like very rarely do the skaters have any ill intent when they're, you know, trying to portray a program. But when she was asked about what they did to research the Aboriginal culture that they were trying to portray, Dominya said, we watch video clips on the internet of those dances and it's really like this, complete with the leaves around the knees. So if you look at their costumes as well, they're dressed like to imitate tribal people, basically, with leaves around their knees and then face paint, and their costume is meant to kind of suggest that they're naked with body paint around them.
The leaves around the knees comment was also shallow because when you think about Indigenous culture in Australia, there are over 500 different tribes of Indigenous peoples in Australia with their own history, their own languages, and their own diverse traditions and cultural practices. So to just have it summed up so casually as leaves around their knees without appreciating exactly what the meaning of that was, from which culture it was, what practice it was referencing, is just an example of how little thought goes into that examination of the practices that they're borrowing.
Because it sounded like all they did was passively observe. My question was, did they talk to any Indigenous people at all? Did they know what the meaning of the leaves were? Why do Aboriginal people put these particular body paint symbols on their bodies? Why do they put leaves around their knees? I think another dimension that isn't often acknowledged is that the music that they performed was composed by Sheila Chandra, who is a Briton of Indian descent. So it didn't really have anything to do with Indigenous culture in the first place. And also within ice skating circles, there were suspicions at the time that they may have borrowed the idea from their Australian rivals, Danielle O'Brien and Greg Merriman. So they're actually a Sydney-based pair that first performed an Aboriginal dance at a Korean competition in 2008. But what Danielle and Greg did was they actually spent a year in consultation with the Indigenous community in Australia to ensure that their performance, music, and costumes respected the Aboriginal culture. So you really get the sense of the gap between someone just frivolously imitating what they saw and not necessarily even in an accurate way versus a skater and team that took the time to do their research and to actually speak to people to find out exactly why the costumes and the appearance of these dancers and Indigenous people were the way that they were. So moving quickly on then, the sort of second facet that we want to tackle a little bit is this idea of cultural insensitivity versus appropriation. So I think there are certain programs and aspects of programs and choreography, for example, that I think personally for me fall short of being appropriative because it might not copy enough of a culture or a facet of a culture enough for it to feel like it's in tribute to a particular culture,
but nonetheless, there are still aspects of it that seem somewhat insensitive. An example of this is Nicole Schott from Germany and her free skate program for this season. So her music is a blend of 3 tracks. She uses Kung Fu Panda, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, and Geisha from Memoirs of a Geisha soundtrack. So, you know, if you look at these 3 pieces of music, like I definitely could not say that Kung Fu Panda is like a sacred Chinese text. And so it would definitely not be, for me, something that is untouchable or that no skater would skate to in the same way that it doesn't hold that weight of cultural significance that, you know, other pieces do. But I would say that the blending of Chinese and Japanese soundtracks is kind of a big no-no, considering that it seemed like the theme of her program was just kind of Asian in general. If you look at the nature of and the style of the costume that she's wearing, for example, and sort of arm choreography like prayer hands and like kung fu-esque like moves, it definitely did feel like there was a strong Asian theme that was coming through. But for me, something like that program raises the question of like, what exactly was the intention of the program? Like, why has she used those particular pieces and put them together? And why insert those hand movements? What is the story that she's trying to portray here? And sadly, like, you know, in my experience growing up in Australia, for example, you often see very innocent and often well-intentioned people who do to kind of just assume and group all Asian cultures together. They don't recognize that Chinese culture is extremely, extremely different from Japanese culture, which is extremely different from Korean culture, and it's not interchangeable. It's not, you know, something that you can just casually piece together. So for me, again, the question is around, it's not a matter of expecting everyone to be perfect or expecting everyone to automatically know these things, but I think it's an important conversation to have, and it's something that I think would be more easily discovered if there was more research and attention paid to this aspect.
And, you know, Asian fusion is something you talk about when talking about food. It shouldn't be something you do in a program.
Yeah, absolutely.
So in the same way that Nicole's program is kind of like a Asian fusion program, that a really generalized view, Alina's Cleopatra program this season is also similar in that it's a Middle Eastern fusion program. It's kind of like a hodgepodge of different pieces of music from different places in the Middle East.
Daniel Gleichengass, the choreographer, chose 3 pieces to string together.
The first piece of music, Peter Gabriel's The Feelings Begin, from the movie Temptations of Christ, is set in Jerusalem. The other one is Maurice Jarre's, who's a French composer, the Lance de la Vie Overture, which depicts, I guess, Syria. And the other one is Kati Hicham Ramses. So it's kind of like, if you're skating to a Cleopatra program, it's kind of really odd that it doesn't have that much to do with Cleopatra itself. Like, usually when people skate to Cleopatra programs, like Caitlin Osmond and Yelizaveta Tuktimishiva skated to it before, they usually skate to music from the soundtrack of the movie. But what Danielle did was just string these pieces of music together to make kind of like a hodgepodge of a muddled Middle Eastern view. So I don't know why they called the program Cleopatra if it doesn't have that much to do with Cleopatra itself. What I think is why they called it Cleopatra and why they did is just because they wanted her to be in the costume for Cleopatra, and they wanted the focus to be on character programs. So when skaters, like, you know, skate as a character, it makes it easier for them to carry the presentation. It's also fun for the skaters because they can understand what they're meant to be showing. But in this particular case, I don't know if Alina really understands the view of Cleopatra that we have. I think she were to skate to something that has to do with Cleopatra, it shouldn't just be like generalizing three pieces that have nothing to do with Cleopatra. And the stories we have about her are limited, but they are there. There are resources to read about Cleopatra's story for a more accurate portrayal, and I think it does a bit of a disservice to the music pieces chosen. So I think if she were to skate to this piece of music, it should be done a bit more tastefully. The music cuts are kind of jarring in places. And as a person from that culture, it's just a lot of confusion. Like, your skating is lovely, but relying on this, like, really cheap stereotypical view of this supposedly exotic culture when it's really not any of these things in the first place. When it's, like, Egypt is really historically loaded, and you could go into so much more depth if you were to skate to these pieces of music. So another example that's occurred quite often, especially this season, is skaters doing Egyptian hands or throwing them in the middle of a program.
And what we mean by that is like just the sideways, like the sort of movements you'll see in sort of hieroglyphics, and the really like bestie squatted knees, and yeah, that kind of movement.
So it's doing these hands kind of like perpetuates, in my opinion, a one-dimensional, stereotypical view of a culture that might not necessarily be tied to the culture nowadays. Like, you don't see Egyptians from today doing this in their dances. So it's kind of seems like a really lazy and shallow way to adopt and just take the exotic exterior and superficial view of that culture. But going back to like historicity of cultures too, our understanding of like ancient Egyptian dances only really comes from whatever murals and hieroglyphics we've managed to recover, which isn't really that much. And it's really hard to distinguish whether the hand movements are tied to something that's spiritual, something that's meant to honor the gods, or to simply, have fun in your dances. So with only like still shot, murals, it's really hard to figure out their meaning. A lot of other people speculate that the dances that you see in the murals are performed for magical purposes, rites of passage, to induce ecstasy, as part of homage or entertainment, or in some cases do actually have the purpose of honoring the gods. So they were both performed as secular and sacred occasions.
So examples of skaters who have been featuring this type of choreography in their programs this season are Alina Zagitova, Satoko Miyahara's short program, and also Chuck and Bates. So again, it's just a question for me about how much research was put into this. And it's an open question because we're not privy to, unfortunately, a lot of the skaters' creation process of their program in deciding to portray, quote unquote, an Egyptian program or Egyptian inspired program. How much research, how much consultation was actually done with people from that culture? And if there was consultation, were there other varieties of more authentic or genuine movements that could have been used so that you could showcase the diversity of, movements that are possible in traditional dance in the Middle East, for example, or from Egypt in general? Definitely understand that choreographers are often pressed for time, they have many clients, but if you're going to choose to portray a culture that's not your own, my personal view is that should be treated with more weight than a regular program, because you are borrowing from a culture that has its own traditions, has its own rich histories of choreography and of movement and dance, and it deserves to be researched in depth. So one aspect I also want to touch on is the co-opting of spiritual chanting and other cultural or spiritual vocalizations as part of a wider program. So two cases I want to talk about is firstly Rika Kihira's International Angel of Peace, which was choreographed by Tom Dixon, and he no doubt played a big part in the music cuts, which are distinctive for having, I believe, up to 8 or 9 different pieces incorporated into it. So it's quite a beast of a free program. And what the theme that Rika emphasized in an interview is that it expresses anger against war and is broadly a program that hopes for world peace. And the distinctive nature of it is in that it incorporates songs from several faiths around the world, including the use of Japanese flute or the shakuhachi. So there's definitely parts that refer to our own culture,
But the chanting in question seems to mostly come from a piece called Sacred Stones by Sheila Chandra. And according to comments on the internet, which is all I could really find on the topic, it uses a Hindu shloka or a chant to Lord Vishnu. So Sheila Chandra is an Indian singer who grew up in England, and this song, Sacred Stones, is part of her album Weaving My Ancestors' Voices, where she's consciously fused musical traditions from India and also from England as a way to express her own hybrid cultural identity. The use in this program of this chanting and of a very consciously religious piece seems to have been done with consideration for the overall theme of the program. And I do appreciate that at the very least the songs chosen are by people who are genuinely from that culture. I guess the questions that I'm left with is what exact messages about peace are they drawing from the faiths that they're referencing? Or were they kind of chosen to be broadly representative of a particular music tradition without further digging? How much of that was incorporated into the choreography, for example? Like, these are all things that I would have loved to see a little bit more awareness of, or things that it would be comforting to know that Tom Dixon or whoever had made the music cuts had consulted people from that cultural background on. But in the absence of further information, I think it's promising that at the very least the program overall has a broader purpose and the music used is authentic. So another example of the incorporation of chanting in a program is Shoma Uno's Great Spirit short program that started off as an exhibition last season. So the lyrics of Great Spirit and the chanting that is present throughout are in the Lakota language, and that is a Native American tribe that lives in North and South Dakota. So the chants itself incorporate references to the Great Spirit, which is many Native American tribes' concept of God or a supreme being. But I guess without knowing more about the chant itself, we can't exactly say more about whether it's allowed or whether it's, a sacred text or what the nature of that particular chant is. But my key issue with Great Spirit is twofold. So the first is that it seems to have been taken from a collab between a trance or EDM musicians. So Armin van Buuren, who's a famous Dutch producer, Vinny Vici, an Israeli producer duo, and Highlight Tribe, which is a French group.
So what concerns me here is that there is no information about whether or not any of them have Native American backgrounds, but we definitely know that they wrote those lyrics themselves with a Lakota dictionary, which is from their Guetta Pen and Clubbing TV interviews. So their aim was to honor family and tribal values, as well as to reference what was going on at Standing Rock, which is the protest, I believe, against the Dakota Access Pipeline. The idea to do a Native American themed piece was from the Israeli duo, but the French group does a lot of world music producing and creating. So they said that they sort of wanted to do a lot of this exotic fusion in the interviews they had when talking about the piece. And they definitely made some pretty dodgy jokes. So I quote, "The lyrics for Great Spirit are in Lakota, so that did involve ethnic research. We almost got scalped a couple of times, but after that things went well." So, I think even beyond the sort of off-color joke that implies that, the Native American tribes are somehow a little bit barbaric or inhuman, I think what is really concerning is that if you have taken the steps to write the lyrics yourself with a dictionary without any of the background yourself, I don't think it's any more elevated than using Google Translate to basically write lyrics that reference explicitly a spiritual being from another culture. And more concerningly, there's no information about the involvement of that tribe in the creation of this piece of music. So we have no idea whether they had given permission to use that chanting, if they had been consulted about whether, the words being used were accurate or not, and if they'd consulted with Native American elders about whether it was even appropriate to reference, things like the Great Spirit and key terms, and the appropriateness of the use in the EDM and trance genre. So I think that's the key concern, especially in the context of a lot of Native American languages, customs, and cultures having been co-opted and interpreted mostly through Western lenses, and their cultural heritage erased by centuries of colonization, oppression, and forced assimilation of their children in mainstream American culture.
The other element that I think was quite egregious was the fact that last season, when it was initially debuted as an exhibition program, it was initially presented with face paint and a costume that was designed to create the illusion that Shoma was topless with a lot of different tattoos and body paint on the design. So he's definitely changed that costume now, but I think the combination of the face paint and that costume that was meant to sort of evoke the feeling of a tribal nature was what pushed the program's interpretation over the edge a little bit when it came to acceptability and a question of taste, because I think the reference to the song's native origins without any consultation on the use of the face paint, like why those particular designs, why that particular costume, I think there was just an absence of thought put into that element. And so for me, that was also kind of worsening the idea that the Native American culture, where they derived all of that inspiration from, wasn't really given a say or consulted on the way that it was interpreted and presented to such a wide audience in the ICE show. So he's changed it up definitely for this season as part of his short program. The face paint and the costumes are gone. So I think in that sense it's good, but again it goes back to the idea that even the source material and music that incorporates cultural influences is not necessarily free from being appropriative in themselves.
One thing that we have to talk about when we're talking about programs that are meant to portray a certain culture is the naming of said programs, because the skaters and the choreographers in conjunction choose the name of the program. So Davis and White's program, they called it Indian folk dance, but the music is from 2 Bollywood movies and is in Bollywood style of dancing, not Indian folk style. And we know that different regions of India have very different dance traditions. So what is really even Indian folk dance?
Yeah, it's again this sense, I think similar to the way that Nicole and Alina's Cleopatra's, it's being quite general about a particular style of dance or a particular music that you're borrowing from, where you could be a lot more specific about exactly what you're actually being inspired by, and in doing so not erasing the fact that there is a great amount of diversity within that particular culture and even in those music traditions. I think it's also important to be mindful as well of not erasing the various traditions and cultures that certain music comes from. So, for example, Rika Kihira's short program this season, Breakfast in Baghdad, has been somewhat criticized online for the fact that it features vocals that are pretty much nonsensical, and its name refers to the Middle East, and there is a sense of exoticism, so to speak, about the music that she's skating to that's very distinctly different from, your classical war horses, especially compared to her last season's Claire de Lune. But Breakfast in Baghdad, actually, only the name really refers to the Middle East, but it was originally composed by a Swedish jazz musician and performed by Yoon Sun-na, who is a Korean vocalist. And she's actually employing scat singing, which is a jazz improvisation technique. So, I think just in this example, it's important to also dig deeper when criticizing a program and not, call a very historical jazz tradition as just nonsensical words, for example.
Yeah, as someone who grew up in Iraq, when I watch this program live at ACI, and when I'm watching it, it's not really feelings of, oh, this hurts because it's called Breakfast in Baghdad. It's just, again, going back to cognitive dissonance that's happening.
Personally, I don't associate jazz with Baghdad or Baghdad with jazz music specifically or automatically. What I think of instead is usually classical poetry or ancient melodies. The artist could have called it Breakfast in Moscow, and it still would have been the same exact song, just with a different title. But seeing as how the album includes North and East Asian jazz styles, I'm inclined to think that the name was chosen because it fits the overall theme of the album and not because it has anything to do with Baghdad itself.
I think the final category of problematic music that we want to talk about then are programs originating from potentially problematic source material. So I think the kind of quintessential example of this is Memoirs of a Geisha. What people who have read or are familiar with the book that the movie was based on would hopefully know is the fact that Arthur Golden, the author, actually had a falling out with the geisha who he consulted with on creating the book. And her name was Mineko Iwasaki. And she was very, very angry about the inaccuracies of his portrayal and described a lot of backlash within the current geisha community in Kyoto as a result. So this actually was like a controversy that did blow up around the novel. This is well known, especially considering how much money the book and both the movie made off of this adaptation and the portrayals. And I also want to add, like, the movie is cast with Chinese and Malaysian actresses. There is no Japanese actress who portrays a major character in the movie. So that's also something to keep in mind. So yeah, a key worry about Memoirs of a Geisha and a key controversy has always been the fact that the person who made this book possible basically cut ties with Golden entirely and was very, very deeply hurt by the decision that he made to not keep her name anonymous, which she requested, and also by the way that he portrayed the geishas that would tarnish their image. So Evgenia Medvedeva is skating to this program this season, and this is one of the most widely known, I guess, topics of cultural appropriation, and arguably probably kicked off a lot of the discussion. So for me, you know, she has said in interviews that she has always wanted to skate to the program. She very deeply loves the movie and has wanted to skate to the program. But I think that it is very possible that she may not know the history of the book and may have just listened to the soundtrack of the movie. But for me, the question is around going back to intent. I would say that Memoirs of a Geisha is probably one of the safest pieces of music to skate to in the skating world because people have skated to it. It's quite a popular track to use when you want to portray Japanese culture. But my question is, in perpetuating a movie and a book that is inaccurate and has caused so much pain in just existing, is that extending the amount of hurt that it is causing the people that are most affected by the source material? And, you know, is it then kind of continuing that degree of exploitation that was definitely happening by the author Golden in his portrayal, but is there a sort of secondary responsibility rolled up in there as well? So my question, I guess, is like, can we be sure that your intent is to 100% appreciate the culture when the material that you're extracting your program and basing your program on has caused so much hurt and therefore could not really be said to be a like authentic or respectful, at least, portrayal of the culture itself?
Yeah, like that goes back to intent and input doesn't always equal output. So what she wanted her output to be was to appreciate Japanese culture. But because she's using such a heavily loaded music that has all this historical complexity in a way, whether subconsciously or not, you can understand why some people would be hurt by this choice. And another contrast to make is Satoko skating to this in the Olympic year.
I would never want it to be as simple as saying, like, if you're a Japanese woman and you skate to something that's problematic, like, it's automatically okay. But I think that in being Japanese, in having your interpretation of a piece be influenced by your authentic cultural background, I think it, in some ways, it mitigates perhaps, or it will filter through some of the inaccuracies a lot better than someone who's not familiar with that culture. So with Satoko, like as with any skater, like they will pick and choose what aspects of the music and of the program to portray. And I think obviously being from that culture, she has a much better grasp on what subtleties, what intricacies to portray from that piece of music than perhaps someone like Evgenia, who was choreographed by Shailin Bourne. So neither of them were from Japan or like are not from that culture. So I think overall it's not as clear cut as I like, you know, as it's fine if you're from that culture and you skate to a problematic piece of music. But I do think that it's doubly something to consider when you are not even from that culture and you are also skating to a piece of music that has demonstrably caused pain to people from that particular world.
So when there's discussions of cultural appropriation happening, there's often the rebuttal of what if there's involvement from people from that culture. So another key concept is, what is the difference between cultural appropriation versus cultural exchange? So cultural exchange lacks that kind of systematic power dynamic that you have when you have minorities and non-minorities. Cultural exchange happens when someone shares ideas, knowledge of their culture with others, with giving consent and the other side giving respect to whatever is being said.
A lot of the pain from cultural appropriation stems from the feeling of being erased and not being consulted in someone else taking your culture and, you know, putting it onto a much larger platform than you yourself may necessarily have access to. And I think it's a running theme with some of the programs that we talked about earlier when it comes to like why we feel that they're disrespectful. And a lot of it is because of the lack of research, the lack of conversation, and the lack of permission in some senses that results from actually interacting with people from that culture and making sure that it's at least passed through the filters of like one or two people who are more intimately like acquainted with the nuances and the deep meanings and the histories of that culture. So that's where I think cultural exchange is quite different, because of the fact that cultural exchange is dictated by the people of that culture. They have the power, they have the say to give that permission to invite other foreign people into their culture, and they're the ones with the control over how the outsider, so to speak, interacts with their culture. So it's really about who has the power in the situation and who is controlling that conversation and giving access. I think it's not as straightforward, again, as saying that, oh, just because you've had like one Chinese person work on this, then the program is fine, even though, you know, the costume might be really disrespectful or whatnot. I mean, I've personally, for example, been asked about Chinese culture by people I work with when they're, you know, trying to write something that speaks to that community. And so much of the time, even as a Chinese person, like I have to caveat it by saying like, oh, this is just my personal experience, because the experiences of people in one culture can be so widely different that it's very hard for someone to then act as almost a representative of that culture and give any sort of permission for a foreigner to portray that culture in any way. But I do think that, again, going back to the theme of listening and not being erased, having someone from that culture as a consultant or just as a sense check at least ensures that something has gone through a degree of filtering and a degree of passing that interpretation by someone who is much more deeply acquainted with the norms, the nuances, the things that you might not know as an outsider and probably can't read about or research. And I think a lot of the time people say, oh, but skaters have limited resources, like they can't do that. Then my kind of question back would be, if you don't have the resources to do it properly, like consider doing something else, really. Because I think it's sort of, you know, what is the priority here? If you don't have the resources to do this, why are you doing this at all?
if you're not going to do it properly.
Right, it is harder for a reason. And another thing that I want to go back to is Yevgenia's Memoirs of a Geisha costume. So her costume is made by Satomi Ito, who's a very well-known Japanese dress designer. So if you're talking about it from an economic angle, Yevgenia consulted Satomi and went all the way to Japan to have fitting, chose one of the sketches, and she had a Japanese person's input on choosing the costume and on the design of the costume as well. And going back to like the economic angle, Satomi is benefiting from this economically because they're paying her to do these costumes, they're paying her to do the sketches, to design the costume. So while the program choice itself raises a lot of questions of intent and a problematic origin in some ways, her costume, it's really good that she went to a Japanese costume designer for this.
I think having Satomi there, like, it ensures that she has access to the resources needed to properly design a kimono, for example, and to have the cultural knowledge of what's important and what isn't important when adapting that kimono for ice skating. And there are all these benefits, I think, that come from having someone from that culture be so intimately involved in the process of that portrayal. So it is something to be commended and something that she's done well. And along the same lines, I think Denis Vasiliev had a samurai program last season as well. So there's no information on who designed his costume, but we do know that Stefan Lambiel, his coach, choreographed the free program with the Japanese contemporary dancer Kenta Kojiri. So it does just indicate that there was some degree of care and attention paid to the fact that he was trying to depict a different culture, and that in doing so, it would be good to have Japanese sensibilities and an eye in the choreography process. So it's things like this that we think are really positive signs of a skater at least very much attempting to acknowledge that they are depicting something that they're not familiar with, and therefore should not be shy about enlisting the expertise and help of those who are more knowledgeable. And I think the last example we'll give for a skater team that did that well is Davis and White's Indian folk dance, despite all issues that we've pointed out with the name.
So Davis and White, they wore traditional outfits in their program. They went into a lot of research when they chose these outfits. They worked with Indian choreographers so that they could use the correct choreography instead of the stereotypical hand gestures that you see in a lot of Western portrayals of Indian dances. So Davis and White actually received letters from fans in India and South Asia who said they enjoyed their routine. Do we have the right to judge whether or not the program they're doing is actually appreciative of the culture?
I think for me, it's about like the fact that they've received letters who really enjoyed the routine, and that I do believe it went somewhat viral on Indian YouTube, I think, at the time. So the fact that it resonated with the people from that culture authentically and they were heaping praise on it, I think is a good indication that they did something right, in the sense of like they had accurately portrayed or spoken to an aspect that resonated with the people from that culture. So I think for any skater like trying to adapt a foreign piece of music or doing a different program, that would be a good barometer, I think, to measure success on.
So the last thing we're going to talk about is where do we want to carry this discussion and what do we want to get out of this discussion. So figure skating started in Europe and kind of came to North America. So it's historically been a predominantly white sport. We talked earlier about gatekeeping and how minorities don't have kind of a platform to show their programs in the first place. So it doesn't increase the disadvantages they face if kind of the acceptable / rewarded version and portrayals of their culture are ones that have been colonized / commodified / capitalized for white audiences.
Yeah, I think it goes back to that question of if the only portrayal of your culture that feels like it would be safely accepted without any extra risk in the sport is one that doesn't authentically come from that culture, that might be problematic in its source material, or that, may
not be an accurate representation of the culture, it begs the question of, is this sport very, very limiting? So I think in that sense, the fact that skaters are taking the risk to, you know, tackle different types of music from different cultures is at a baseline. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's good that there is interest in portraying cultures that aren't just, you know, traditionally white and based in European tradition. But again, like we said at the very beginning, the more that you try and portray different cultures, the more issues arise with the way that you do so. So it is very much a kind of a up and down journey, and it's very unrealistic to expect that every skater gets it right from the get-go. So I think what's really important is also, it's not a crime to not know that something you've done is problematic or something that you've done has inadvertently caused pain to people from that culture. But I think what's important is the response that you display when being called out for it. So, you know, responses where the choreographer or the costume designer acts very defensive and closes off all avenue for discussion, I think is worrying, and I don't think is the right way to go about it. But I do think that when talking about such a constantly evolving concept and a very grey area, a lot more sensitivity needs to be shown, both by people criticizing and also by the people attempting to portray these programs and cultures.
An example that comes to mind when you think of non-Western skaters kind of bringing pieces of their own culture into the skating world is Yuna's Homage to Korea program. So she skated this program both in competition and she also skated as exhibitions. So her intent was to show people what Korean music sounded like, especially because Korean skating and figure skating haven't been around for a really long amount of time. So it's just really, really nice to see her bring that music into the skating world.
And I just also want to add that the music that she was skating to was Arirang, which is a really, really iconic Korean piece of music. It's a Korean folk song that's often considered to be like the unofficial anthem of Korea. So it really is something that was also a really big risk for her to do, given her position as like one of the top skaters in the world at that time, and with all the media scrutiny on her, she would have been subject to so much extra criticism, so much extra scrutiny, and to put her reputation on the line to take a risk and skate to an unfamiliar piece of music, I think is something that needs to be commended, because it's not easy to do that.
No, unfamiliar to the judges and to the audiences too sometimes. So Yus is another example of a top skater bringing aspects of his own culture into the sport, and as Lay mentioned, taking a risk with music that hasn't really made its way into the skating world. So when you're thinking about Hope and Legacy, and when you're thinking about Seime,
there was a lot of risk that he took, especially with Hope and Legacy. I think Seime, in having that traditional like music structure of like that really iconic climax and the exciting drum beats and all of that stuff, I think it was a little bit easier to understand for Western audiences. But there was a lot of commentary when Hope and Legacy first debuted about how it was a snooze fest, how like people didn't really get it, and it was very much not particularly rewarded by the judges in program component scores throughout the season. Granted, he didn't skate cleanly, but even at the World Championships where he skated cleanly, I think there was a certain amount of media where it wasn't easily understood. But something that Yuzu's done when describing the piece is that it is quite Japanese in its approach, in that he kind of left the interpretation open to the audience. He didn't really impose his own reading of the music on there. And so that kind of music style and that style of skating was in itself a very big risk in the figure skating world and what it tends to hold as popular music.
And his Seime program is based on a character, and like we said earlier, characters, it's easier to skate to music that are centered on characters because it's easier to act out the characters. But he still did a whole lot of research on the movie where the Seimei soundtrack came from.
Nomura Mansai was the actor for Seimei in the Omyoji movies that the soundtrack was based on, and he's also a very successful and iconic stage performer in Japan. There was an interview that Yuzuru did with Nomura Mansai about ways of expression and performance that was very unique to his particular style of kyogen, which is a type of Japanese theater.
For both programs, the Japanese culture has benefited because of exposure and because he did a lot of research and consulted people to make sure he has the most accurate portrayal.
So I think Yuna Kim and Yuzuru Hanyu's acts of bringing music from their own culture, especially considering their position as top skaters of their time, is really something that we need to commend. And it's something that I can't overstate, like how, I guess, risky it was in many senses of the word, despite the fact that they were in the top of their game, to sort of deviate from that general tradition and to really like authentically bring facet of their culture and have a mind to showcase that using their platform to a wider audience. And I think especially in Yuzuru's case, you can really see the flow-on effects of that. So there have been numerous examples of junior skaters and skaters from other countries using the music of Seimei, using the music of Hope and Legacy, and all the stuff that he's popularized in their programs. So in that sense, it's sort of an example of how you can create new music traditions and new cultural traditions by extension through taking a risk. But just as top skaters are disproportionately criticized for their music choices, that's also the opportunity that they have with them to take risks and tell new stories with what they're portraying. So on that note, thank you so much for listening. We hope to see you again for our next episode.
If you want to get in touch with us, then please feel free to contact us via our website, inthelowpodcast.com, or on Twitter or Instagram. You can find our episodes on YouTube, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and Spotify.
If you enjoy the show and want to help support the team, then please consider making a donation to us on our Ko-fi page. And we'd like to give a huge thank you to all the listeners who have contributed to our team thus far.
You can find the links to all our social media pages and our coffee on the website.
If you're listening on iTunes, please consider leaving a rating and review if you enjoyed the show. Thanks for listening. This has been Lay
and Maryam.
Bye.
Bye.